Page 423. This was 1937, the second year of the so-called Myokan prosperity in Moscow and other big cities. And even today, in the reminiscences of journalists and writers, one gets the impression that at the time there was plenty of everything. This concept seems to have gone down in history, and there is a danger of it staying there. And yet, in November 1936, 2 years after the abolition of bread rationing, a secret directive was published in Ivanovo province and other provinces prohibiting the sale of flour. In those years, many housewives in small towns, and particularly in villages, still used to bake their own bread. Prohibiting the sale of flour meant do not eat bread. In the district center of Katy, long bread lines formed, such as never before been seen. However, they attacked the problem too by forbidding the baking of black bread in district centers, permitting only expensive white bread to be baked. The only bakery in the whole Katy district was the one in the district center, and people began to pour into the center from the villages to get black bread. The waterhouses of the district consumer cooperative had flour, but the two parallel prohibitions blocked all avenues by which it could be made available to the public. Vlasov, however, managed to find a way out of the impasse, and despite the clever government rules, he kept the district fed for a whole year. He went out to the collective farms and got 8 of them to agree to set up public bakeries in empty kulak huts. In other words, they would simply bring in firewood and set the women to baking in ordinary Russian peasant ovens. But mind you, ovens which were now socialized, publicly, not privately owned. The district consumer cooperative would undertake to supply them with flour. There is eternal simplicity to a solution once it has been discovered. Without building any bakeries, for which he had no funds, Vlasov sent them up in one day. Without carrying on a trade in flour, he released flour from the waterhouse continually and proceeded to order more from the provincial center. Without selling black bread in the district center, he gave the district black bread. Yes, he did not violate the letter of the instructions, but he violated their spirit, for their essence was to compel a reduction in flour consumption by starving people. And so, of course, there were good grounds for criticizing him at the district party committee. Excuse me. After that criticism, he remained free overnight and was arrested next morning. He was a tough little bantam rooster. He was short. He always carried his head slightly thrown back with a touch of aggressiveness. He tried to avoid surrendering his party membership card because no decision expelling him from the party had been reached at the district party committee the night before. He also refused to give up his identification card as a deputy of the district Soviet, so since he had been elected by the people, and the district executive committee had not taken any decision depriving him of his deputy's immunity. But the police did not appreciate such formalities and overpowered him, and took them away by main force. They took him from the district consumer cooperative down the main street of Katy in broad daylight, and his young merchandise manager, a Komsomol member, saw him from the window of the district party committee headquarters. At that time, not everyone, especially in the villages, because of their naivete, had learned to keep quiet about what they thought. The merchandise manager shouted, "Look at those bastards! Now they've taken away my boss too." Right then and there, without leaving the room, they expelled him from both the district party committee and from the Komsomol, and he slid down the well-known pathway into the bottomless pit. Vlasov was arrested very late in comparison with the others who were charged in the same case. The case had been nearly completed without him, and it was in the process of being set up as an open trial. They took him to the Ivanovo NKVD internal prison, but since he was the last to be involved, he was not subjected to any heavy pressure. He was interrogated twice. There was no supporting testimony from witnesses, and the file of his interrogation was filed with summary reports of the district consumer cooperative and clips from the district newspaper. Vlasov was charged with initiating breadlines and having an inadequate minimum assortment of merchandise, just as though the unavailable merchandise existed somewhere else, and someone had offered it to Katie. Procuring a surplus of salt, but this was the obligatory mobilization reserve. Ever since ancient times, people in Russia have been afraid of being without salt in the event of war. At the end of September, the defendants were brought to Katy for public trial. It was not a short trip. Remember how cheap the OSOs and the closed courts were. From Ivanova to Kinishma, they went in a Stolypin railway car, then 70 miles from Kinishma to Katy in automobiles. There were more than 10 cars, an unusual find along an old deserted road, and one that aroused astonishment, fear, and the expectation of war in the villages. Klugen, the chief of the Special Secret Department of the Provincial NKVD for Counter-Revolutionary Organizations, got these names here, was responsible for the faultless organization of the whole trial and for terrifying the public with it. The convoy consisted of 40 guards from the reserves of the mounted police, and every day from September 24th to 27th, with swords unsheathed and Nagwan revolvers at the ready, they took the prisoners from the district NKVD to the still unfinished club building back through the village where they had until recently been the government. Windows had already been installed in the club, but the stage had not yet been finished. There was no electricity in Katy at all. At nightfall, the court met by the light of kerosene lamps. The spectators were brought in from the collective farms in rotation. All Katy crowded in as well. Not only did they sit on the windowsills and benches, but they stood packed in the aisles, 700 of them at a time. Russians have always loved spectacles. The forward benches were regularly reserved for communists to provide the court with dependable support. A special assize of the provincial court had been constituted, consisting of deputy chairman of the provincial court, Shubin, who presided, and members of Bish and Zauzarov. The provincial prosecutor, Karasik, a graduate of Dorpat University, was in charge of the prosecution, and even though all the accused declined defense lawyers, a government lawyer was forced on them, so that the case wouldn't be left without a prosecutor. The formal indictment, solemn, menacing, and lengthy, came down in essence to the charge that it was an underground rightist Bukharanite group that had existed in the Katy district, which had been formed in Ivanova. In other words, you could expect arrests in Ivanova too, and had it as its purpose to overthrow by wrecking the Soviet government in the village of Katy, and this was about the remotest boondock in all Russia. In all Russia, the rightists could have found for a starting point. Prosecutor petitioned the court to have Stavrov's testimony given before his death in prison, read to the court, and accepted as evidence. In fact, the whole charge against the group was based on Stavrov's evidence. The court agreed to include the testimony of the deceased, just as if he were alive, with the advantage, however, that none of the defendants could refute it. But darkest Katie did not appreciate these scholarly fine points. They waited to see what came next. The testimony of Stavrov, who had been killed under interrogation, was read to the court and once again became part of the record. The questioning of all the defendants began, and immediately there was chaos. All of them repudiated the testimony they had given during the interrogation. It's not clear how, in such an event, things would have been arranged in the October Hall of the House of the Unions in Moscow, but here, at any rate, it was decided shamelessly to continue. The judge rebuked the defendants. How could you have given different testimony during the interrogation? Univer, very weak, replied in a barely audible voice, "As a communist, I cannot, in a public trial, describe the interrogation methods of the NKVD. Now there was a model for the Bukharin trial. Now that's what keeps them together. More than anything else, they are worried that people might think ill of the party. Their judges had long since stopped worrying about that." During the recess, Klugen visited the cells of the defendants. He said to Vlasov, "You've heard how Smirnov and Univer played the whore, the bastards. You've got to admit your guilt and tell the whole truth. The truth and nothing but the truth." Willingly agreed Vlasov, who had not yet weakened. "The truth and nothing but the truth, that you are every bit as bad as the German fascist." Klugen flew into a rage. "Listen here, you whore. You'll pay with your blood." From that moment, Vlasov was pushed forward from a back seat among the defendants to a leading role in the trial as the ideological leader of the group. The crowd jamming the aisles grew interested whenever the court fearlessly broke into questions about breadlines, about things that touched everyone present to the quick. And of course, bread had been put on unrestricted sale just before the trial, and there were no breadlines that day. A question to the accused Smirnov. "Did you know about the breadlines in the district?" "Yes, of course. They stretched from the store itself right up to the building of the district party committee." "And what did you do about them?" Notwithstanding the torture he had endured, Smirnov had preserved his resounding voice and tranquil righteousness. The broad-shouldered man with a simple face and light brown hair answered slowly, and the whole hall heard every word he said. "Since all appeals to organizations in the provincial capital had failed, I instructed Vlasov to write a report to Comrade Stalin. And why didn't you write it?" They hadn't yet known about it. They had certainly missed that one. "We did write it, and I sent it by courier directly to the Central Committee, bypassing the provincial leaders. A copy was kept in the district committee files." The whole courtroom held its breath. The court itself was in a commotion. It shouldn't have continued questioning, but nonetheless, someone asked, "And what happened?" And indeed, that question was on the lips of everyone in the courtroom. What happened? Smirnov did not sob, did not groan over the death of his ideal. And that's what's missing in the Moscow trials. He replied loudly and calmly, "Nothing, there was no answer." And his tired voice seemed to say, "Well, that, in fact, was just what I expected." There was no answer. From the father and teacher, there was no answer. The public trial had already reached its zenith. It had already shown the masses the black heart of the cannibal. And the trial could have been called off right then and there. But oh no, they didn't have the sense enough for that, or tact enough for that. They kept rubbing away at the befouled spot for 3 more days. The prosecutor raised a hue and cry, "Double dealing." That's what it was. They engaged in wrecking. With one hand in the other, they dared to write Comrade Stalin. And they even expected a reply from him. let the defendant Vlasov tell us how he pulled off such a nightmarish piece of wrecking that he stopped the sale of flour and the baking of rye bread in the district center. Vlasov, the bantam rooster, didn't have to be asked to rise. He had already jumped up, and he shouted resoundingly through the hall, "I agree to give a full answer to the court, but on condition that you, the prosecutor, Karasik, leave the accuser's rostrum and sit down here next to me." It was incomprehensible. Noise, shouting, call them to order. What's going on? Having gotten the floor with this maneuver, Vlasov explained willingly. The prohibitions on selling flour and baking rye were instituted by decree of the Provincial Executive Committee. One of the permanent members of its presidium is Provincial Prosecutor Karasik. If that's wrecking, then why didn't you veto it as a prosecutor? That means you were a wrecker even before I was. The prosecutor choked. It was a swift, well-placed blow. The court was at a loss. The judge mumbled, "If necessary, we will try the prosecutor too, but today we are trying you. Two truths. It all depends on your rank." "I demand that he be removed from the prosecutor's rostrum," insisted the indefatigable, irrepressible Vlasov. Recess. Now, in terms of indoctrinating the masses, just what significance could such a trial have? But they kept on and on. After questioning the defendants, they began to question the witnesses. The bookkeeper. "What do you know about Vlasov's wrecking activities?" "Nothing." "How can that be?" "I was in the witness's room and I didn't hear what was said in here." "You don't have to hear. Many documents passed through your hands. You couldn't help but know. The documents were all in proper order." "But here's a stack of district newspapers, and even there they are writing about Vlasov's wrecking activities, and you claim you didn't know anything? Well, go ask the people who wrote the articles." Then there was the manager of the bread store. "Tell me, does the Soviet government have much bread?" "Well now, just how could you answer that? Who was going to say I didn't count it?" "A lot." "Why are there bread lines at your store?" "I don't know." "Who was in charge?" "I don't know." "What do you mean you don't know? Who was in charge of your store?" "Vasily Grigorievich." "What the devil? What do you mean calling him Vasily Grigorievich?" Defendant Vlasov. "That means he was in charge." The witness fell silent. The judge of the court dictated to the stenographer the answer. As a consequence of the wrecking activity of Vlasov, bread lines resulted, notwithstanding the Soviet government's enormous stocks of bread. Repressing his own fears, the prosecutor delivered a long and angry speech. The defense lawyer, for the most part, defended only himself, emphasizing that the interests of the motherland were as dear to him as they were to any honest citizen. In its final words to the court, Smirnov asked for nothing and expressed no repentance for anything. So far as we can reconstruct it now, he was a firm person and too forthright to have lasted through 1937. When Saburov begged that his life be spared, not for me but for my little children, Vlasov, out of vexation, pulled him back by the jacket. "You're a fool." Vlasov himself did not fail to take advantage of this last chance to talk back impudently. "I consider you not a court but actors pretending to be a court in a stage farce where the roles have already been written for you. You are engaged in a repulsive provocation on the part of the NKVD. You are going to sentence me to be shot no matter what I say. I believe one thing only. The time will come when you will be here in my place." The court spent from 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. composing the verdict, and all the while the kerosene lamps were burning in the hall, and the defendants sat beneath drawn sabers, and there was a hum of conversation among the spectators who had not left, and just as it took them a long time to compose the verdict, it took them a long time to read it. piling up on top of one another all kinds of fantastic working activities, contacts, and plans. Smirnov, Univer, Saburov, and Vlasov were sentenced to be shot. 2 others got 10 years, 1 to 8 years. In addition, the verdict of the court led to the exposure of an additional wrecking organization in the Komsomol in Katy, whose members were, of course, immediately arrested. Remember the young merchandise manager? And of a center of underground organizations in Ivanova, which was, of course, in its turn subordinate to Moscow. One more nail in Bukharin's coffin. After the solemn words "to be shot," the judges paused for applause, but the mood in the hall was so gloomy, with the sighs and tears of people who had no connection with the defendants and the screams and swooning of their relatives, that no applause was to be heard even for the first 2 benches where the party members were sitting. This indeed was totally improper. "Oh, good Lord, what have you done?" Someone in the hall shouted at the members of the court. Univer's wife dissolved into tears, and in the darkness the crowd began to stir. Vlasov shouted at the front benches, "Come on, you bastards, why aren't you clapping? Some communists you are." The political commissar of the guards platoon ran up to him and shoved his revolver in his face. Vlasov reached out to grab the revolver, but a policeman ran up and pushed back his political commissar, who had been guilty of a blunder. The chief of the convoy gave the command. Arms at the ready, and 30 police carbines and the pistols of the local NKVD men were aimed at the defendants and at the crowd. It seemed at the time as though the crowd would rush forward to free the defendants. The hall was lit only by a few kerosene lamps, and the semi-darkness heightened the general confusion and fear. The crowd, finally convinced, not so much by the trials as by the carbines now leveled at it, pushed in a panic against the doors and windows. The wood cracked and broke, glass tinkled, Univer's wife in a dead faint, and almost trampled to death, and was left lying beneath the chairs until morning. And there was never any applause. Not only couldn't the condemned prisoners be shot then and there, but they had to be kept under even stricter guard because they really had nothing to lose at all. And they had to be taken to the provincial capital for execution. They managed to cope with the first problem, sending them off by night to the NKVD along Main Street. By having each condemned man guarded by 5 men, one of the guards carried a lantern, one went ahead with a pistol at the ready, 2 held the condemned prisoners by the arms and kept their pistols in their free hands. The 5th brought up the rear with his pistol pointed at the condemned man's back. The rest of the police were arranged in formation in order to prevent an attack by the crowd. Every reasonable man will now agree that the NKVD could have never carried out its great assignment if they had fussed about with open trials. And that is why public political trials were never really put down roots in our country. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.